welcome to the MessianTics podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now, here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby.
Hey everybody, today we're going to start our conversation off with addressing the idea of bringing in and engaging with renewed or even new fellowship with unaffiliated congregations, because largely within Messianic Judaism, your bigger organizations are the IMCS, / MJAA, the UMJC. You've got groups like Tikkun and Avad Ami, but outside of those four, those are kind of the four more well-known ones. But a lot of Messianic congregations are more unaffiliated, and sometimes that's just due to they haven't been brought in the fold yet. Sometimes that's due to they have, theological positions that they either already feel they'll be excluded for or looked down on for, so they don't choose to affiliate. Or you have some that are actually, kind of given the left foot of fellowship and maybe not, rather than going through a process of teaching, education, and restoration, are just kind of, thrown to the curb or made to feel as though they're less than for believing what they believe, or, looking at positions where they look at what have you. So today we want to discuss about, how can we, one, bring in unaffiliated congregations that there's nothing like wrong theologically or practically. It's just they're unaffiliated. What strengths would a more denominational structured organization have in bringing those in versus, kind of where we are now, which is voluntary fellowship. It's funny. It's like we have voluntary fellowship, but, involuntary, removal from that fellowship if you, don't agree with our...
I like that. Voluntary fellowship, involuntary removal.
Yeah, so it's, kind of, to me, it's ironic. And then, how can we also bring in congregations and groups and restore fellowships with groups that maybe have a different position on something that maybe not, it may actually be wrong. It may actually be just a bad position. It's not that it's like we disagree, but it may actually be, how do we restore relationships with those people? And I saw another Messianic teacher had done an interview recently on basically the idea was discipling. How do you disciple Hebrew roots out of Hebrew roots, if that makes any sense? Like how do you right. bring people into the fellowship that maybe were in a not healthy place spiritually into a place that is healthy spiritually? So with that, Toby.
Yeah, I just wanted to say before we get into that, and this is part of the discussion, maybe Rabbi Eric or Rabbi David can for some of our listeners, because I know we have listeners that, like, I know one particular guy, a friend of mine that listens, and he's new to Messianic Judaism. And for the sake of those people, I think we should define, some of the theological problems that we're talking about here. Like David, and Eric, we've talked about two house, Hebrew roots, two sticks, sacred name. Can we just kind of try to give a 10-cent definition so people can understand what we're tackling when we're talking about bringing unaffiliated congregations or congregations with unacceptable theological differences?
Okay, so before we dive into that, I just want to separate or segment unaffiliated congregations. I would qualify as being like independent congregations that just
right.
aren't connected to organizations. Not that they have theological issues, but the two house, Hebrew roots, that whole thing.
Some can be sound, but I just think that for the sake of our listeners, I think they should know, like, well, what's Hebrew roots? What's two sticks? What's two house? Because it's important that they know, because they can get pulled into that.
Right. Okay. So first of all, I wanted to say that as we're going into this conversation, this is a continuing conversation of our discussion about the positives of being a fellowship or a denomination. And I think that if we were more structured, as I would like to have, not out of independent fellowship at all, totally, but more structured, we could actually have people that spent time doing what we're going to be talking about today. In other words, you could actually have a committee of people that reached out to the unaffiliated. And when we're talking about unaffiliated, we're talking about congregations that are Messianic congregations that teach what we would deem as valid theology, good, solid theology, that are just not part of one of the main organizations, and give them reasons why it would be good for them to become part of the one of the organizations, or a unified organization. On the other side of that, we have people that are, for instance, Hebrew roots, which are largely led by non-Jewish people, which is not a bad thing on its own, but they've separated themselves from Messianic Judaism largely in a response, in my opinion, to, and again, this is my opinion, as Rabbi David said last episode, so you guys agree or disagree, it's up to you, but largely because of the feeling of being considered second class within Messianic Judaism because they're non-Jewish.
I agree with you.
That they established, we want to do feasts and festivals, we want to worship on Shabbat, we want to
wear talit,
we want to read the Torah, we want to do these things, we want to have that expression, but we don't feel welcome within the greater Messianic Jewish movement, so we've started our own thing.
And I wouldn't call it just your opinion, I'd call it a theory, because we have factual evidence to back that up.
When I say Hebrew roots, that's the group that I'm talking about in this case. In many cases, they have sound theology, but it's a separated thing from Messianic Judaism, purposeful division from Messianic Judaism for a number of reasons, but in my opinion, a large reason is the feeling of, whether perceived or real, of being second-class citizens within the community, and thus we can't be a part of Messianic Judaism, so we'll do those things separate, and we'll call it Hebrew roots.
Right.
Then there are groups that we call sacred name. Now, I want to differentiate that in all of these things I'm talking about, there's a vast swath of things. So there are people that would fall in the sacred name category, or would be considered sacred name, that just feel as if, because the four-letter name is in the Bible, that we should use, at least say the letters if we aren't going to pronounce the name. In other words, when we're reading a verse, when we come to where it says in Hebrew, Yod He Vav He, that when we come to that, instead of saying Adonai or Lord or Hashem or something else or God, that we should say Yod He Vav He. After all, his name's in the Bible 6,000 times. There should be something to that. So there's that group that isn't trying to pronounce it any certain way. They're not saying, if you don't say it this way, God can't hear you. They're not using all the different variants. And then we have on the other end of the pendulum those that believe they got a direct revelation from somewhere on how to pronounce that name, and that all people who pronounce it other ways are wrong.
And every single one of these people that I've met that have a quote-unquote direct revelation seem to all have different pronunciations.
Yeah, it's all different, yeah. And they will defend it to the very end.
Right. So sacred name are those who in some way esteem the four-letter name to such a value that it must be used in some way. Now, and I want to say there is value to that name. I don't want to diminish that in any way, but that would be the sacred name group. Two House is a group that started a number of years ago. It's close to 30 years ago as a movement, and this was largely non-Jewish people who read the Bible to say that there are the Jews, which are from the tribe of Judah, and there's the other tribes, and the other tribes were scattered among the nations, and the original teaching was that if you feel a call to Messianic Judaism, you are a descendant of one of those lost tribes, and you need to proclaim yourself Israel, and that there are no Gentiles or non-Jews in the kingdom, but that Yeshua came only for the sheep of the lost house of Israel. So Gentiles aren't going to be saved. It's kind of a Calvinist type. There are those that are going to be saved and those that are going to be lost, and that judgment's already been made. So if you feel called to Messianic Judaism, you are either from the tribe of Judah and therefore identifiably Jewish, or you are one of the lost tribes and you should call yourself Israel. And to the extent, to the point where they would tell people to pray until God revealed which tribe they were from, and then they should start proclaiming that tribal connection. And so that's where we get this Ephraim versus Judah dynamic that came out. So that's the two. And again, I'm giving a broad brush.
And the two house terminology, two house, two sticks, as some people will call it, terminology comes from the Ezekiel passage of the two becoming one again, Ephraim and Judah becoming one again, and so it's like a
basically
exasperation of that.
All believers, followers of Yeshua, are Jewish somehow.
Yeah,
that's Israel by blood.
Yeah, we're ethnic.
The problem with that, though, and this is going to steer off our topic for just a second, but the problem for me with that is that if that's the case, if that's true, if all, and their thing is all believers who feel called to Torah are Jewish, and they may go a little farther, or Israel, sorry, and they may go a little farther than that, depending on who you're talking to. But the problem with that is if that's the case, and let's just say, hypothetically, every believer in the world suddenly started keeping Torah today, if that's the case, and there are no Gentiles in the body of Messiah, and that's just not biblical.
Right. And without getting too sidetracked, my biggest problem with the two-house movement is it's depending on the wrong blood for redemption.
Yeah.
We're not redeemed. I'm not redeemed because I have Jewish blood. Someone's not redeemed because they have Israelite blood. We're redeemed because Yeshua shed his blood.
Right, absolutely.
And that when we focus on our blood instead of his blood, endless genealogies, all that stuff we're taught against in the Bible. Mm-hmm. So we've covered sacred name to a broad extent.
Yeah.
We've covered two house to a broad extent. So those are the two biggest versions of things. There are also groups that believe in the duality of God. In other words, that there are two gods, that God the Father is one God, and that Yeshua is a second lesser God. So there's that group. There's also the groups that believe in I can't even think of the other term for it, but there's sectionals of different groups off of those things. So there's those groups. There are also, and so those groups are people that we need to, I believe, reach out to and try to teach the more balanced view of things. And so I think that it's up to us in Messianic Jewish. And I will say this, that I have been successful in reaching out to leaders of unaffiliated or two-house or sacred name groups, and led them through time, through relationship, through teaching, into a healthier biblical viewpoint within the body. So it is possible to do this if there's effort made to do it in doing so.
And one of the keys to that, and this is to kind of pivot us into the discussion, one of the keys to this, I think, is...
Oh, I remember what the other one is now. So if I can do it. One law, but when I say one law, I'm talking one law in an unhealthy way. We all know there's one Torah.
Right.
But that Torah affects individuals in different ways. If you're a Cohen, it affects you differently than if you're not a Cohen. If you're a Levite, it affects you differently than if you're not a Levite. If you're a soldier or a merchant or in agriculture, or you're male or you're female.
Right.
There's the one Torah position. And again, we're talking about the full errant position, is that there's one law that applies equally to all people. And so that there is no roles and divisions based upon who you are or what you are, but it's everybody is accountable to every law, irrespective of the biblical divisions that God put in His Word.
Right.
So part of the conversation as we kind of pivot to our discussion on reaching out to unaffiliated independent congregations to try and foster relationship and bringing into organizational experience, and then also trying to restore those that are on the peripheral with some of these potentially problematic theologies and ideologies. I think one of the biggest hurdles that we have to get over is, and I think this is, I don't know that this is necessarily a denominational fellowship issue or what, but one of the biggest hurdles I think we have to get over is that in mainstream Messianic Judaism, we have a habit of being more than happy and rapid response on things that we want to condemn. So writing white papers and theological positions and pamphlets and books and such, condemning bad theology like the two-house movement, the one law ideology, etc. We're quick to condemn those things and it, in essence, push them away out of fellowship as quick as possible, as far away from us as we possibly can. Now, part of that is some people are in those, for instance, people in the two-house Ephraimite Hebrew roots kind of circles, some of them are there because they're Gentile. They feel cold to Messianic Judaism or to a Torah-observant kind of faith in Messiah connected to Judaism. And they went to Messianic Jewish synagogues that had a very terrible, very negative perspective and outlook of Gentiles in Messianic Judaism.
Right.
And they found zero affirmation for the call that they legitimately felt on their heart in the Spirit to be a part of Messianic Judaism. And so that call didn't fade, that work of the Spirit didn't fade, so they went to hunt down somewhere, somehow, somebody that would affirm that call. And so there are a lot of people, a lot of Gentiles in those peripheral movements that are there because we, mainstream Messianic Judaism, pushed them away. Whether it was because we had a unhealthy, unbalanced perspective of a Gentile role in Messianic Judaism, or also because we are quick to condemn, and we will condemn these and push them away. But I have yet to see very much effort. Rabbi Eric, as a side, he's not necessarily a part of this, but I've yet to see very much effort put in by mainstream Messianic Judaism to reach across the line that we created. We draw the line in the sand. I've yet to see many people reach across that line and go, hey, listen, you already know I think this is an unhealthy perspective. Can we just sit down over coffee or over a beer or over lunch and let's just talk about this? And let's work towards maybe finding some middle ground, some restoration, some opportunity for unity, and bringing those people in.
Let me say, I think two things. One is I think that Messianic Judaism in a large way treats these doctrines the same way that the government treated COVID. In other words, we're not really going after trying to heal those that actually have a bad doctrine. We're just quarantining entire groups of people just in case they might have that doctrine. The other thing I wanted to say is that I believe, and again, this is me, I believe that it is just as abhorrent a doctrine to make Gentiles second-class citizens within the kingdom as two-house, as one law, as the versions of sacred nameism that would be contrary to Scripture, all those things. I think that when you separate, the Gentiles as a second class, as a lesser being, as the things I've heard people say, leaders
there
of
are
Messianic
congregations that won't do a bar bat mitzvah for Gentile kids. That for some they were doing these makeup things they called bar or bat Avrahams, B'nai Avraham ceremony. There are some now that are apparently doing confirmations for Gentile kids because they can't do a bar bat mitzvah, or they won't let them
or
wear
they won't let them wear a tallit. They won't let them wear a kippah. Now, what's ridiculous is if you go to Jerusalem and you walk, if President Biden walked up to the Western Wall, one of those rabbis would hand him a kippah as he walked up, and we'd have a picture of President Biden, a Catholic, getting up with a kippah on. And these are Orthodox rabbis who run the wall, and they have no problem at all with a Gentile wearing a kippah.
By the way,
that place.
they also would be perfectly happy with getting to bring him over and wrap tefillin.
Right.
Teach him how to wrap tefillin.
Teach him how to do it.
And so on.
So these things are things that we need to understand and deal with, but we have hurt. We keep breaking down the wall of division that God keep building back the wall of division that God keeps breaking down, and it's hurtful. We have people that have absolutely no problem accepting the money from Gentiles.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But they won't let them read the Torah in their synagogues or come up on the platform and read from the Haftorah. It's okay if they read the Brit Chadashah because somehow that's, even though it's God's word, and we say we believe it's God's word from Genesis to Maps.
And even though it was predominantly written by Jews.
Right.
Yeah.
Just like the Torah.
Right. But we will let Gentiles read the Brit Chadashah or the New Covenant writings, but we won't let them read from the Tanakh. And this is, in my opinion, the reason we have these abhorrent places, because we're not letting people come and participate in Messianic Jewish synagogues where they would hear a balanced teaching from the Torah.
And this is two things. One, this is something Rabbi Toby and I were actually having a conversation about on the way in.
Yeah, we're pretty fired up.
That I'm going to have him, I'm going to throw the ball towards him in a minute.
Toby's like ready to go.
Right, kind of carry on some of what he was talking about in our conversation earlier. But I do want to say, and look, I don't make shameless plugs very often on this, but I will say that in the coming months, I have a new book that'll be coming out dealing with the issue of the one new man and a healthy biblical perspective from Genesis through Revelation on what the idea of the one new man truly looks like, Jew and Gentile, particularly as pertains Messianic Judaism, but it carries over to the body of Messiah as a whole. But
you almost done writing it?
I am a lot closer than I was a few weeks ago. Okay. So, hey, this one's taking me a lot less than the Spirit and Spirit and Truth took me 3.5 years to do. So this one I'm hoping to have done later this summer. But nonetheless, I just want to throw that out there. I will be releasing that in the coming months, and as we get closer to its release, we'll talk about it on the podcast and let you know where you can find it at.
So me and David were on the way here today, and it came up, and because it's something we talk about a lot. I think it's important that's a forefront in our discussions. I think that some people need to talk about it more, but again, I think it's a problem within the movement. I mean, we have a family that came to our congregation a few months ago. They're not Jewish, and we had them over for dinner at our house, and we were in a discussion. Me and the guy was, his husband and wife and their kids, and I was talking to the husband, and I was just sharing with him my story, Messianic Judaism. He was sharing his, and somehow the subject of a talit came up, and I said, "Do you have a talit?" It's a question that I ask actually a lot of men in the movement that I meet, that I connect with. Do you have a talit? And he goes, no. He goes, actually. I said, well, why not? I said, you've been doing this for years. He goes, I never felt like I was allowed to wear one, and I felt like the Holy Spirit led me. I can't not credit God. I immediately went into my bedroom and grabbed one and said, here, you got one now.
Yeah. I
said, every man in the movement, Jew or Gentile, should have a talit. And I said, and I told David about it, and David told his wife Danny, Rabbi David told Danny, and she cried, and I get that. And I have sat across the table and shared meals at Messianic conferences. I've sat across and shared table with other people that I know feel that I'm less than they are because they're Jewish and I'm not. And I think, and I'm just going to say it, and then we can move on, because I think we need to get into some practical applications of how to reach out. I want to get into that. I don't want because we've had episodes, and I'm sure we'll have episodes in the future about the problem with Gentiles being treated badly in the movement. But here is how I feel. If you want to know how I feel about it, it is sinful behavior. It is a sinful viewpoint. And if it's sinful, then it doesn't come from God. It comes from the enemy. It is absolutely demonic, and I think it's disgusting in God's eyes.
And as you said,
there we go.
As you said in the right here, the biggest part of it, and it goes back to what Rabbi Eric was saying about, which blood are you chasing after, right? And the reality is it is a matter of pride.
Well,
it's identity. It's identity idolatry. It's identity idolatry.
I've told people before so many of God's promises for the world to come involve Gentiles streaming, not just like coming in onesie twosies, but the nations will stream.
Did you just say onesies, twosies?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, he's a brand new dad.
Yeah, I've got a baby.
He's
boy.
into onesies and stuff.
Yeah.
You start saying cute. You start using the word cute. And
so I don't want us to get.
Well, can I finish?
Yeah,
sorry.
I thought you were.
I was David before David. Interrupted me. Yeah.
So I didn't actually interrupt you. I interrupted him.
Yes,
I just want to make sure that's.
Yeah. But the nations will stream up to the house of the God of Jacob, and are welcomed. I mean, even
grab the garment.
Grab the garment of a Jew. It'll be a house of prayer for all nations. So this. It really it's sinful. I agree with you. It's also you actually call God a liar when you make Gentiles less than you use,
and you're cheapening the blood of Messiah over them.
Yeah. So,
and in the same sense that Messianic Judaism will do that, separating Jew and Gentile, the church, on the other hand, will then say, well, the fact that you're Jewish doesn't matter, because Paul says there's not a Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. Yeah. But the reality is those, and this goes back to what Rabbi Eric was saying, is just because there's the Jew and Gentile become one doesn't mean there aren't unique distinctions or unique purposes. Those work together within the Messianic movement.
Unique
and
callings.
But in the same sense, we don't take down the male and female. Well, most of us don't take down the male and female bathroom signs, right? Like when I go into Brit Am over here while we're recording, when I go to Brit Am, there's a very clear, distinct men's bathroom and a very clear, distinct women's bathroom. And you know what? Still preaching Paul's words. There's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. Clearly male and female bathrooms. So there's clearly still distinctions. Yeah. Right. But those distinctions are there to support one another, not to break one another down.
So I want to bring us back to the topic of our discussion, because we've covered some of the aberrant teachings, the peripheral. But I believe, and this again is me, I believe that we won't see the ability to go and teach en masse, to be able to actually reach these unaffiliated or these people with false teachings, until we, as the Messianic movement, start walking in oneness, not just between Jew and non-Jew, which we have to do. And that's not doing away with differentiations and roles, but walking as wild branches and natural branches grafted into the same tree, and until we start working together as organizations. And again, I'm fine with there being an IMCS and a UMJC and other organizations, as long as we're walking together in unity to accomplish those things. In other words, I look at it like there's the cancer research, and there's diabetes research, and there's other things. And you can have separate goals and functions and purposes, but the purpose altogether is to see these diseases healed. And when it comes to the kingdom, if our goal is to see all Jewish people and all non-Jewish people accept the Messiah of Israel and start walking in unity and fulfill the prayer of Messiah, then it's fine if we have some that are more deep into education, some into more liturgy, some into more halakha, some into more different things, as long as our goal together is to work together for the fulfillment of promise.
And it's kind of like, our congregation Maim Chaim, and your congregation, Brit Am Messianic Synagogue, are two distinctly different congregations. We're in two geographically different locations. Our service times are different. You start at 10, we start at 10:30. Which one's better? Who knows? Who cares? It doesn't really matter. But we have different service structure, different way that we do things, different liturgies that are used, and things like this, different ways of worship,
different cantorals.
Exactly. But the reality is we work together in unity. And there are things that, Rabbi Eric will call me up and say, hey, can you send me, like he just did this a couple of months ago, hey, can you send me your slides about this particular part of your service, because there's something I saw you doing in there that I really liked and I want to model in my congregation. And I'll call him up and say, hey, we're having this issue. Here's this crisis we're dealing with, or here's this, theological thing that's arisen off in the distance, or whatever. You've got a lot more experience at this. Like, how have you handled stuff like this? If this happened in your, and he'll do the same thing. Hey, I have this going on. I just want your take. Like, what would you do? How would you respond? Like, he's got his strengths. I've got my strengths. We both have our weaknesses, and we're willing to, for the furthering of the kingdom, to set our differences aside, because we are in a lot of ways very different in the way we do things. but we're willing to set the differences aside and come together on the things that we agree on so that we can work for the furthering of the kingdom.
And those differences aren't theological differences. They're practical differences. And we're not going to, we're doing a study on marriage and divorce right now at Synagogue. And one of the things we were sharing about marriage was that every couple should have some couple that they look at that are ahead of them in time and marriage, that are a healthy marriage that they can pattern after. In other words, if you're having a fight with your wife because she's doing something or you're doing something that's not, and you're not getting along, don't go to another couple that's having the exact same fight and look for an answer. You look for healthy people so that you can model after healthy people. And the same thing, if we want to lead people that are two house or people that are one law or people that are sacred name or people that are any of the other peripheral things into a healthy relationship with God, they're not going to find that. They're not going to be open to that if we're as dysfunctional as they are. They're not going to be looking for biblical, godly answers if we're fighting amongst ourselves, and they're not. When you look at some of these conferences for some of these groups, they have more people at their conferences than we have at our conferences because they're not in an uproar and fighting and casting stones and all that stuff.
And they're all in unity against us. They figured out how to make unity work. Maybe we should try.
Yeah.
But even at that, if we're talking about, for instance, like we have two different, they feed into each other. We have two different things that we really want to deal with in this episode. One is reaching out to unaffiliated or independent congregations and drawing them in, building relationships, not necessarily making them become a part of it, but fellowshipping with them, bringing them in unity. Yeah. And then the other is restoring people in peripheral theological domains, right? And, and bringing them, I'm trying not to use terrible terminology for that, and bringing them in and working towards restoration, because it's really easy to condemn something. It's, I think, a more godly thing once you've condemned the issue, not the people, the issue. It's a more godly thing to work towards restoration. And I think in order to work towards restoration, and again, I broached this subject last episode, and I will once again caveat and say my opinion, my thoughts. Feel free to join me or throw stones, whichever way, until our organizations, all of the mainstream Messianic Jewish organizations, can legitimately model true Spirit-led restoration among ourselves. Mm-hmm. Again, like Rabbi Eric said, that doesn't mean we have to be one big, giant, happy organization, but we have to work legitimately together, not against each other, not put on a good show on stage when we're together, but then talk about each other in backstabbing ways separately. Until we're actually modeling legitimate restoration, we can never truly expect to figure out how to bring others into restored relationship with us either. That model has to be there. It has to be forefront. It has to be, and that doesn't mean that the wounds of the past and the distrust and all that are going to fade away instantly. Some of that's going to take time to get over, but we have to try. We have to actually work towards that. The reality is I just don't think we do enough of it.
Right, and part of this restoration that we're talking about isn't just with groups that were outside of us, like the Two House or Sacred Name, but we have within people that were part of our movement, that were part of our organizations, that we have parted ways with, sometimes
violently,
for good reasons. But we have made no effort. The Bible says, restore such a one. If someone falls, it's up to us to try to restore them. Now, I understand that there's times we have to put people out. Somebody is teaching something that's wrong, is acting wrong, somebody's got caught up in some sin or whatever, and we have to separate from them. But we tend to end at that point, rather than trying to reach out and after that separation, after that, to then make effort to try to restore them back to a place of restoration. We have people that we've cast out of our organizations that we've made once the casting out is done, we've made no effort to go back and at least try and say, look, we had this differences. We'd like to meet with you and see if there's a way to restore this, a way to fix this, a way to welcome you back into the fold. And if the person rejects it, then they reject it. But even if they reject it the first time, we should still go back and try to repair things. We do that in our congregations. When somebody leaves our congregation, we spend a lot of time trying to get them to come back to our congregation. Why we don't do that organizationally? And why do we leave hurting people out in the wilderness when we could possibly bring them back?
Yeah, and I think that's probably one of the weaknesses of the fellowship model. I mean, it can exist in a denominational model. I'm not saying that that's like the denominational idea is the end all be all to answering this, but in the fellowship model, it very quickly can deteriorate to an echo chamber where we have a disagreement. Let me talk about all these other leaders and people in our particular movement or side or sect or whatever, and because we all disagree, we're all going to just, it's kind of like we were joking about earlier, the voluntary fellowship and the involuntary, disfellowship, you just get removed and booted out and then talked bad about and continue to be talked bad about for years for no reason. And it's just gossip. It's wrong. But you get treated terribly because of an echo chamber. Whereas if, this strength, at least I find a strength in something like a denominational model, is you have an actual judiciary process where it's like you have someone, a third party, someone who's not attached to this argument between the two people or groups, and it's like, okay, is this really something that is worth kicking them out over, or is it just a disagreement about whether it's practice? Because kicking someone out over when you say like teaching something that's wrong or bad, what is wrong or bad? Like obviously there's certain obviously if you're teaching, you can have multiple wives. No, that's got to
right.
go.
Well,
but
for
this
instance,
is
the teaching that Yeshua's not God would be a reason.
Yeah, things like that. But there's a lot of other things teaching. Are we going to separate meat and dairy? Are we going to observe the additional day, the diaspora day on the calendar? Those kinds of things, like
which counting of the Omer?
Because there are people who will teach differently. There are people even within the IMCS that do differently, congregationally. And so, do you then just kick everybody who it's a contrary thing, kick them out, or do we actually find a balance and go, I can see how you're coming up with that particular thing, and I'm going to try to figure out how to balance my relationship with you with also not agreeing with this 100%, because it's not necessarily good versus evil.
Right, and denominational structure or that kind of a structure allows for a standard to be laid. In other words, everybody would be judged by the same equal weights and measures. For instance, in our movement, it tends to be that, for instance, if somebody would sit down and eat a big plate of bacon, there would not be somebody saying you have to get out of the organization because you are eating bacon. Your observance of kashrut is not the same as mine. But there would be somebody on the other end who says, because you follow a more orthodox halakha, you can't be part of this.
Yeah.
And so we need to have that. If our basic statement of faith says you have to believe this, and this, then everybody who fits within that framework should be welcomed, regardless of how much pork they eat, or regardless of having two kitchens or two separate, milk and meat kitchens, or not driving on the Sabbath, or all the things that would be on the end of a more frum observance level. So those things, and we're not that. We tend to not use those equal weights and measures. And because we're fellowship, we don't have that same structure that says this is our standard, and then judge people based upon that, and honestly say, look, this doesn't fall within that scope. the pre-trib, post-trib, tri-trib, this trib, that doesn't fall within the scope. The which day you observe for counting the Omer and Shavuot, that doesn't fall within the scope of that. What level of kashrut you keep, that doesn't fall within the scope of this. Do you do the second day observance on the feast days? That doesn't fall in the scope. Do you read the triennial Torah reading or the annual? That doesn't fall within the scope. Those things that we shouldn't be divided over should not be there. And having a denominational structure or a more involved structure, more accountable structure, would stop some of this divisiveness over separate issues that are majoring on minors.
Right. So I guess this is more of a question. And by the way, just if that denomination ever did happen for Messianic Judaism, I definitely think there has to be a mention of, I pray by God's grace we get to that point where there is no there's no treating Gentiles differently or prohibiting them from synagogue, all parts of synagogue
Absolutely.
life, So, but I this is more throwing it back out to you guys. So, how do you guys think we formally or systematically, what would be a solution? Because that's kind of what I've been thinking as we've been talking. Is like, okay, I'm going to play devil's advocate or somebody who's listening. I'm acting as a listener. Okay, so how would it be done? How would Messianic Judaism? Of course, it's a two-sided issue. We have to work on our own issues. But how would we start to
bring in unaffiliated groups?
Yeah, how would we approach them? What do we set up some kind of unity conference and have them invite them to talk? I mean, you know what I'm saying?
So I'll say first, and I'll deal solely with the unaffiliated independent congregations right now. For me, I would approach it the same way I approach relationships with churches in our areas. If I find out there's a independent Messianic congregation, like my goal is not to recruit them to the IMCS or the UMJC. My goal is to build a relationship, fellowship, unity. And if that leads to their connecting to mainstream organizations, great. And when at least for me, when I'm talking about reaching out to unaffiliated or independent congregations, it's not about recruiting them to an organization. Some of them have very legitimate, very valid reasons why they're not a part of one of the major organizations. Right. Some of them were and left. They didn't go into peripheral, weird theological stuff. They still maintain the same identity as a Messianic congregation they have. They just had to leave for whatever reason. They chose to make that separation. So for me, I would begin in those scenarios with reaching out a hand. Let's get together. Okay, great. We're in reasonably close territory to each other, but this isn't my kingdom and your kingdom. This is his kingdom. So what can we do to benefit each other? How can we support each other? How can we sow into each other's lives? What do you have that I could benefit from? What do I have that you could benefit from that we could share with each other? So I would work on bolstering that relationship first, building unity, and then from there, if God opens up those doors and those opportunities, try to make those connections into the great organizations. Yeah. But my goal wouldn't necessarily be recruitment for those for either organization that I'm a part of, but rather to begin the discussion of fellowship and unity together.
Because just before Jonathan, because for me the toughest thing before we even hit record, for me the toughest thing was like, man, how would a Messianic rabbi go up to a rabbi or a pastor or a leader of a Hebrew roots congregation who they very ardently believe in what they're believing? How do you find that common ground or even restore good theology in them? It's just, I'm like, I can't even wrap my mind around how to even start that, but it's important that we don't just talk about the problems but the solutions.
Yeah, I think part of it has to begin with understanding where your authority begins and ends. For example, in the fellowship model, there's no baseline for practice, really. There's a couple very vague statements about believing Yeshua is the Messiah, he's divine, he's the Son of God. We believe God is one. We believe in the
restoration of Israel.
Restoration of Israel and the continuing validation of walking Jewish lives as believers in Messiah. But other than that, there's no real baseline for what that means, because all of that's kind of all over the place. So, basically, it's like, how can you, You do not have authority then to hyperextend your arm to push others away or to bring them in. So I think to even bother discussing, how can we bring unaffiliated congregations in, we've actually got to have a base for which you can bring someone to. For example, you're building a house, you have to be able to tell the concrete guy where to show up. If you don't actually have a position or place for where to show up, how are you going to get concrete poured for the foundation? How are you going to bother to build framework for a house? You can't, because you don't have the ability to do that. I was in a Facebook group once, which I left largely because of this was part of one of the many reasons I left. It was a Messianic / Hebrew roots Torah observant kind of group, and there were the moderators dropped a list one day on people that they had, quote unquote, removed because they had differing positions on certain things. And I was like, who are you? Who are you to have such authority? Because I knew for a fact that a lot of the moderators had different positions on different things. So I'm like, none of you agree on certain things. So what? This is just a subjective, exclusionary practice you're doing here. And so it wasn't long after that I left, because it was wrong. And so to say, well, we're not affiliated with them, we're not going to bring them in, we're kicking them out, and to not have a standard yourself that you actually employ. And look, like, it's not like we can play, secret police with congregations and go and like make sure that all the congregations are enforcing each individual line. But like at a start, you can have the basics at conferences. For example, we all know at the Rosen Plaza, they have the ability to have a kosher kitchen. So there is no reason why you should have people who are visible. I'm not even talking about leaders, but people who are visible voices in the Messianic movement eating and participating in non-kosher things at a conference, in public, in front of people. No excuse for that. So you have no authority, then you lose authority when it comes to that. So in order to bring unaffiliated groups in, first there actually has to be a standard that we uphold. At a minimum, the public ones, the conferences and things.
Saying,
And I think that one of the things you said that really jumped out at me is know what you have authority over.
Yeah.
For instance, when I went, and we've been blessed to be involved in bringing a number of independent congregations into the fold, or at least into relationship.
Yeah.
But when I went out to speak to those leaders and to have coffee with them and to build a relationship with them, I didn't go as if I had authority over them.
Yeah.
As if I'm Messianic Judaism, I'm IMCS or UMJC, and you're not. So that gives me some kind of. I went with the idea that, hey, I want to get to know you. I want you to get to know me. And there isn't a perfect congregation, and my congregation isn't perfect, and I don't know everything, but I want to build relationship with you and try to connect our communities so that we can strengthen one another if that's possible, and open the door for that communication, that friendship. And I was very honest. When people would ask me, well, what do you believe about this two house, or what do you believe about sacred name, or whatever, I was very honest about what I believe, but not condemning, but discussing and leading. And so that's a big thing, but you can't go out as if you're the end all and be all of all things and try to convince somebody that they should submit to you when they don't know who you are, and they're already offended because you made them feel like less than to begin with. So that's a big thing. And you can't bring somebody into an operating room unless the operating room is clean.
Right.
If it's not a sterile environment, if it's not a safe environment, you can't bring someone in to do surgery. And so we need to, as a community, make our own environment a safe environment. Sure. To bring people in, and then we can talk about excising cancer from people's theology.
And you have to have doctors and nurses that are actually practicing doctors and nurses.
Right, and that's why I say this more structured, because you can actually have people that are chosen by the organization to be the representatives that go out and speak on behalf of the organization to reach out to these. There's some 300 independent fellowships.
There's a lot, yeah,
out there that are not crazies. These are not people that teach, strange stuff. These are people that are just communities that are unaffiliated with an organization. And if we were to send people out to these communities in love and in a way that doesn't show we're great, you're not, we're Rome, we're out to conquer the world, the Borg from Star Trek, assimilate, or right. you must assimilate. If we go in with the right attitude, there's no telling how many of these groups would feel welcomed to be part of what we do. But because we're so schismed in fellowship model, where each individual congregation is in a survival mode for their own congregation, we really don't go out and invite people to become part of, people to come, invite unaffiliated leaders to come to the rabbis conference and be there and see what's available and meet people and all that.
And excuse me, and let's be honest, the organizations could benefit if we had, I hate to word it this way, but if we did some sort of a quote unquote perks system, where if we prioritized reaching out to independent and unaffiliated congregations on the organizational level in a way where, hey, if you bring, a lot of times you get this with different tours and stuff, right? If you bring X number of people with you that are from an unaffiliated, unassociated congregation to the rabbis conference or to this or to that as an introduction and making the introductions, then you can come to the conference for free, or you can whatever, we'll give you some sort of a comp. And I know that that's a really weird way to present the discussion from the organizational side, but the reality is doing something like that could actually potentially make it where it's not just a priority, but it's something people want to do, because I think we saw that with the Messianic Leadership Roundtable that JVMI did, Jonathan Burtis and Jewish Voice Ministries did, is you saw a ton, and I mean a ton, of people that are connected to Messianic Judaism, but from the church world side that were there. You saw a ton of independent congregational leaders that were there as representation. You saw a ton of organizational leaders that were there.
Para-ministries.
Yeah. And so the reality is that JVMI figured out a way to make it work, to get all the people in the room together, and very literally, whether it was followed up on our end afterwards or not, they figured out how to get unity to happen. How to and in a lot of ways, JVMI and the MLR brought a lot of restoration of relationships between a lot of people. Because of the MLR, I have relationships with other leaders from other organizations that I never knew growing up, because I grew up in the IMCS. I didn't know Union guys. I didn't know Jews for Jesus guys. I didn't know Chosen People guys. I didn't know all these different things that are out there. I didn't know any of them because I was never connected. But now I've got relationships with some of them because of the MLR and because of some of the relationships that developed from there and other things. If we learn to actually model unity, and we made it a priority, and on the organizational level they prioritized it by saying, hey, here's what we would like to see happen. We want you to participate, right? Because the reality is reaching out to these independent congregations can only work if the local congregations do that, right? I would imagine in the Atlanta area, just the metropolitan Atlanta area, there's I would guess maybe 4 or 5,
so about
at
6
least,
congregations,
independent congregations. Yeah. Plus, there's an IMCS congregation there. I think there's a Union congregation in the area.
There was.
Okay, there was, and so on. But there's 5 or 6 independent congregations there in the Atlanta. Atlanta's a huge area. There's a lot of Jewish people there. Look, Baldwin County, where our congregation is in Daphne, there's about 5,000 Jewish people, give or take, and that's about 4,999 more than I can handle on my own. So it would not hurt my feelings if you did the math. That means I can handle one. That means that if there was a congregation that started up in the Baldwin County area, and let's say they open up in Foley or Gulf Shores or whatever, it would not break my heart. In fact, I would want to have a relationship with them because the reality is that's a strengthening of the kingdom in the county. And all of a sudden, we've doubled the potential of people we could reach, Jews and Gentiles alike. We've doubled the potential.
There's a reason that every time a McDonald's opens up, there's a Burger King and a Hardee's that opens up in the same area, and a Taco Bell or somewhere else, because having more options brings more consumers. And it's the same thing in ministry. If you have more options, because there are people there, and the truth is there are people that live by Rabbi David's congregation that drive to our congregation for service, and there's people that live by our congregation that attend his congregation faithfully and are part of his community. That's because his service feeds them in a way that our service didn't. It's not right or wrong, it's just different. And so same thing with Rabbi Wayne's congregation or Dothan, or Rabbi Paul's congregation. We fellowship together, we work together. And when somebody comes to visit my congregation, if they live in Baldwin County, I tell them, there's a congregation in Baldwin County, you should go check that out and see if it's home for you. Or to Rabbi Wayne, if there's somebody comes from Navarre or Crestview or Niceville, I say, hey, there's a congregation in Santa Rosa County, if you should go check that out. It's not about my kingdom, it's about the kingdom, and it's about working together. But there are people that go to Rabbi Wayne's congregation that live closer to us. And there are ones that live closer to him that come to our congregation. And because some people want McDonald's and some people want Burger King and some people want Hardee's and so on. So it's not competition, it's unity that we need to be working with. And so as we continue this conversation about the denomination versus fellowship model, and again, both have positives. We're not knocking either one, but we are saying that I believe, or at least we believe, that there could be some effort, greater effort made if we work together to reach out to the unaffiliated and to some of these groups that teach doctrines and teachings that aren't valid, so that we can educate and draw them into a valid expression of Messianic Judaism.
And with that, we're not saying one is better than the other. We're not saying we should become one giant denominator. We're just saying, look, we can do a lot more together. However that together works out, we can do a lot more together than we do currently separated. And figuring out how to make that structure sustainable and productive is, I think, where the priority needs to be and where all these questions are coming from. So,
well, thanks so much for tuning in. Join us again next week as we dig into another discussion about MessianTics.
Thank you for listening to the MessianTics podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at MessianTics Podcast.